But we're glad to have y'all for the fifth Urban Ag Council Lunch and Learn. And, we're going to have another one next week, but these have been terrific. Participation has been really good. So we appreciate y'all making time. And for those that are also getting CEUs, that's a good thing as well. But it's a great privilege today to have, we've had some terrific leaders in the industry that have already spoken to the membership. And today is certainly no exception. Having Matthew Chappell here from UGA is just an exceptional leader in the nursery sector. We all know that. We're very fortunate to have him in Georgia. Always afraid that somebody's going to steal these good folks away from us. But we're excited to have him. He's been part of UGA now for 15 years. That picture you see, we were talking earlier, it's a very young, I think, a marathon running version of Matthew from back in the day. But we're glad he's like a lot of us, myself included, has decided to add a beard to his wardrobe. But he's located in Athens. You're still in Athens, aren't you, Matthew?
Yes, sir, I am.
In the Hoke Smith building. I actually was a student worker over there. I used to work in the mailroom down there back in the day. If you can.
Oh, wow. It hasn't changed.
Yeah, no, it hadn't changed ever. But we're glad that you're there in Athens. We've talked to folks that have been all over the state as a part of these Lunch and Learn. So that's maybe one of the blessings that comes out of this whole COVID and Zoom process, that we get to engage with folks from all over. So, but we're excited to have you, and I'll turn it over to you. You want to share your screen, and hey, everybody, what we're going to do is Matthew he's very good at working with students and keeping up with the chat. So if you have a question, or when you have a question, just throw it up in the chat box. And then between the two of us, I don't think Matthew will need me to help him out, but between the two of us, we'll catch it as it shows up and try to address them at that time. And if we miss it, we'll come back at the end and we'll square up. So Matthew, it's all you, my friend. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Let me make sure I've got everything working here. You can see my screen all right?
You're looking good.
All right. Fantastic. Get everything set up the way I want it. So I appreciate being invited to talk today, both to those who are live and those who are going to tune in later. Hope you can glean from today one overarching theme. All of my presentations, be it to industry groups or to students, my goal isn't to drill information into you that you can then regurgitate. My goal is to kind of get your mind thinking about a general philosophy, in this case, host plant resistance. So I'll use list of plants and I'll use plants as examples, but host plant resistance is something both from the biotic side, so disease and insects, but also the abiotic side, for example, temperature or drought stress, that there are a multitude of options that are available. I just use examples. And so, be creative as you go through this presentation, and then as you walk away from this presentation. Again, if you ever have questions, the Cooperative Extension Service is here for you, both the county level as well as state specialists like myself and Bob Westerfeld and Clint Waltz, three good examples. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So a couple of things first off the bat. Number one is I do write a international newsletter. You can do a Google search for Nursery and Landscape Insider. Sign up for it. It's free. It comes out twice a month. And I usually have as much sarcasm as they will allow me to have when I'm writing the newsletter. We cover new plants. We cover legislative issues from the federal side, or sometimes the states, if they're really obnoxious regulations from the states, and try to keep up to date on a lot of things. So it's a good way to really fast kind of to scroll through and see what's going on in the industry. New products, we cover a lot of those too. But on the pest side, my colleague at Clemson, who's JC Chung, also has a Pest Talks newsletter. Again, it's free. Both of these are through Ball Publishing. His comes out once a month, but it also talks a lot about new pests, like the dreaded spotted lanternfly that we're all pretty concerned about right now at the university level, at least. But, his is also an excellent newsletter to take advantage of. And then when it comes to a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, myself and a group of colleagues from 11 different universities in the Eastern United States got together, and we've written 3 different books, 2 on shrubs and 1 on trees. So this is an IPM book. Again, it's free. You can do a Google search for the name, which is IPM for Select Deciduous Trees. If you do a Google search for that, it should come up first. And they are chaptered based upon the genus. So if you've got a landscape issue with birch, you can basically look at the birch chapter. It has pictures, it has descriptions, it has chemical recommendation, it has life cycles. So hopefully it is a comprehensive resource that if you have a problem on a genus, you can use these. What we try to do is we try to cover the top 10 landscape trees in the Eastern United States and the top 10 shrubs that are used in the Eastern United States based upon USDA value. But to get to the actual meat of the conversation today, I like to start with this idea of a pest management philosophy. First thing you have to realize, and you have to let your clients realize, is that there is no cure-all in pest control. There is a balance that is always underway. And it's not just pest control, but it's also abiotic issues like that late freeze we had. Some things are out of our control. We can try to minimize damage, but we're not going to completely eliminate damage. So dependence upon any one strategy to either overcome pest resistance or abiotic issues is going to have an undesirable effect. I like to use the example of the balance between thrips and mites. So oftentimes we spray for one or the other, and we particularly spray for thrips, not realizing that if we have a thrip outbreak in a landscape, the thrips actually consume the larvae of the spider mites. And so if we kill all the thrips, then the mite population is going to explode. So there's always a balancing act. We also, in many cases, we don't want to completely eliminate the pests because in the case of thrips actually are controlling our spider mites in addition to feeding on our plants. So there's got to be a balance. So we also have to determine the correct cause of the pest problem. It's interesting that for homeowners, it's about 80% of the time, 70 to 80% of the time, the homeowner misdiagnoses the problem. In the case of commercial companies, landscape contractors, it's about 30% of the time. So there's still a large amount of misidentification. So make sure you correctly identify the pest, because your control, chemical control in particular, is going to be dependent upon your identification. If your ID is wrong, your chemical control is going to be wrong. So double check, triple check. This is where you can use the Cooperative Extension Service. You can send the county agent a photograph of the damage or the pest itself if it's big enough to photograph. I don't know if it'll smile for you. Or disease damage, you can send that to the county agent. If they don't know what it is, they'll send it to us, the state specialist, and you can get a proper ID because it's a lot of money wasted on chemical treatments if you're not treating the right pest or disease. And then again, you're never going to eradicate a pest. And the reason being is because it's on the neighbor's property, it's in the hayfield next door. So some damage is unavoidable. Really the hardest part that we do in horticulture, and particularly on the landscape contracting side, is we make this, it's very difficult for us to convince our clients that they have to accept some level of damage. I think this is where education comes in as well. There's a good amount of educational resources out there through Extension, both in Georgia, but our surrounding states, be it Tennessee or Florida, or God forbid, Auburn. They do actually a really good job on the extension side, even though I torment them consistently. So we have to remember that pest management is this continuum, and most of our clients want to be in the best category, when in actuality, when you survey landscape contractors, when you survey university professors, IPM specialists at nurseries and greenhouses, most of the time they want to be in this good to fair range. And it's based upon this idea of an economic threshold. So how much damage are we willing to accept before we have to spray? So this is kind of a thing that you can use, these visuals like this, to explain to clients that, yes, it is a continuum, and we're trying to keep you out of the fair to poor range. And that's when it really becomes an eyesore, okay? But damage that occurs, but you only see it when you get really close to the plant, oftentimes we're not at that economic threshold yet. So the other thing, and everyone has seen this is the disease triangle. You could just as easily strike the disease and write in insects. And I'm terrible at writing on computers, so I'll just do the I for insects, because it's a similar triangle for insects. Okay, you have to have a favorable environment for disease and insects. That's generally temperatures. A lot of insects, Japanese beetles, I'll use that as an example. It's really soil temperature that determines when their emergence is going to happen, but it is an environmental cue. You have to have the pathogen or the insect present, okay? So in the case of Japanese beetles, if we're not treating our lawn or our landscape for Japanese beetles, they are going to migrate in from around us, from forested area or fields or other people's lawns who don't treat. But we can minimize or we can lower the population if we treat the immediate area around it. And then you have to have a plant or a susceptible host, okay? I'll take Japanese beetles, for example, since I was just talking about that. Roses and crepe myrtles, okay? Not just a susceptible host, but for us, the practitioner, we have to find, or we have to understand this concept of indicator plants. So where in the landscape do we look? What plant do we look at first to see either that disease or that insect? For Japanese beetle, I go straight to crepe myrtle or rose, because those are some of the first things you see in a landscape. Once we see these, in the case of these very destructive foliar feeders like a Japanese beetle, we want to spray immediately. If it's something that's less noticeable, like aphids or potentially even whiteflies in the landscape, maybe we monitor them until we start to see an appreciable level of damage, and then we treat to maintain the population, but below that threshold. And like we've all heard before, you got to have all three of these to really foster damage. And what we're going to focus on today is what I've circled at the bottom, which is this host plant resistance. One thing we have to understand is host plant resistance alone can be overcome, and it's usually overcome through plant stress. So, wood-boring insects are a great example. There is a continuum of trees. So granulate ambrosia beetle is one that's become kind of a thorn in people's side. Granulate ambrosia beetle, there are some trees in the landscape like red buds and smaller caliper maples that have thin bark are really consistently attacked by the granulate ambrosia beetle. But when the tree is stressed, particularly drought stressed, or the landscape is drought stressed, the population can get a little out of control, and it won't just focus on some of our thin bark species. They can kind of migrate over to smaller caliper oaks or birch or beech. So the stress oftentimes will magnify the damage, even in things that we say are either tolerant, which means they get attacked less frequently, or resistant, meaning unless circumstances are really extreme, they resist the attack by, in this case, granulate ambrosia beetle. So what are we talking about? Environmental stresses. So the first thing we have to understand is every plant has a sweet spot, and that sweet spot is different for every plant. I'll give you an example. A hydrangea in the state of Georgia in the southeastern United States, outside of the mountains themselves, Blairsville up to Chattanooga area, we typically have to put them in an environment where you have afternoon shade and ample soil moisture to avoid that daily flagging, which is a moisture stress. that moisture stress can lead to the plant being less able to fend off or tolerate both insect as well as disease later in the season. So it's an accumulation of stress, just like a person who's malnourished, okay? It predisposes you to other ailments later on in life, or in a year, in this case, for plants. So the inability of that plant to adapt to the local growing environment is important. You take that same exact hydrangea bought from the same nursery, grown exactly the same, all the way from a rooted cutting, and you put it in Massachusetts, where there's very little stress from an environmental standpoint. They have cool nights, cooler days, pretty decent rainfall throughout the summer, heavier organic-based soils, and that plant is almost never stressed, even in full sun, okay? So where we put a plant, not only the plant itself, but the environment we put it in, the combination of the two work together to lead to stress or lead to less stressful conditions. So we have to remember, it's that old adage, right plant in the right place. The three big ones that we suffer or we deal with in Georgia are taking plants that prefer dry conditions and putting in wet spots, the reverse, taking, and I just mentioned hydrangea is a water hog kind of a plant, putting them in dry locations, and then too much light. So we take things that are zone 6, 7, 8 plants, or 5 zone USDA hardiness zone 5 to 8 plants. We're in the southern part of that range. That usually means the warmer the temperature, the more shade you need to put it in the afternoon in particular, to mitigate some of that stress due to heat. Too much light means too much heat, and that can lead to heat stress and drought stress. So that's one thing that I always mention in this, is when we talk about environmental stress, know where that plant, look at the tag, and if we're on the southern end of that hardiness, if we're on the warm side of that, for example, zone 5 is, east to central Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, all the way down. Zone 8 is where we are in Georgia. That's a huge range. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we acknowledge that we're a lot warmer, and so we need to put these plants in areas that are cooler, lower elevations where cold air pools at night, in shady environments in the afternoon where they receive morning sun to help facilitate flowering, and afternoon shade to help them stay cooler and not get overly heat stressed. But just like too much light, we can put plants in too little light. Too little light causes stretching, and it can also cause a lack of flowering. We can also deal in Georgia, and it seems to be happening more and more frequently, with these late freezes or frosts that incur cold injury. There are plants that you can select, and even cultivars within a species that you can select, that are later to break bud. And because they're later, they escape the freeze or frost. We'll talk about some of those examples in a little bit. And then I've talked ad nauseum, or a whole lot, about heat stress. So, I think you know that one by now. So what I wanted to do is go through some of these cultivars that I use, or these species that I use as examples of either biotic or abiotic tolerances. Now, one thing I start with is that oftentimes in horticulture, and I'm a plant breeder, I have a plant breeding background. My research program is focused on new plant development. But I'll say this at the same time, I think oftentimes we rely on these new, interesting species and cultivars that are pretty darn weak. So if we really are getting into a landscape, if we're asked to evaluate a landscape, and we have to think about it, it's going to be unirrigated, it's hot, it's sunny, it's poor soils. Look at the plants that were used in the what I call pre-irrigation era. In the case of Forsythia, this was brought to the United States in the late 1700s. And you can be daggone sure nobody cared about irrigating an ornamental plant in the late 1700s. They cared about feeding themselves, okay? So these are plants that, have been popular for the entirety of our nation, and for, all except the last really 40 to 50 years have gone into completely unirrigated landscapes, and they thrive, okay? Forsythia is a great example. Excellent drought stress, even in really poor soils, west sides of buildings where you have extreme heat and light in the afternoon, and they still thrive, okay? So that's kind of abiotic, and I like to use it as an example, and I'll mention this throughout the presentation is, you know, sometimes when we're talking to clients, when we're talking to homeowners or business owners, we have to make them realize that, you know, the latest and greatest oftentimes means slightly weaker growth or more what I call a niche plant. So it'll fit in one particular place, but once it leaves that place, it's going to perform much worse. And we have to make them aware of this. So here's another interesting one, and a lot of us use this in landscapes. It's becoming way more popular, and that's the Alyssium. So we have a native Alyssium floridanum. There's several Asian species, parviflorum, that are on the market as one example. But all of these are native to areas that are boggy in the winter, sometimes standing water, particularly Alyssium floridanum. In the panhandle of Florida, these are in areas that are in standing water during the winter, but they're under deciduous trees like Nyssa, which is tupelo, or bald cypress. So in the summer, in the non-rainy season or more intermittent rainy season, under this deciduous tree, they're in areas that are deep sandy soils and become really dry. And so what that tells us is that they can tolerate wet soils and dry soils. They have learned the ability to tolerate the wet soils and the root rots that come along with that. And they've learned, or they've developed an ability to handle these dry sites. And another thing I'll say is that when you find plants like Alyssium that have these thicker leaves and it has a waxy coat on the outside of the leaf, that waxy coat is an evolutionary mechanism to prevent water loss from the leaf. And so that means that they have evolved to tolerate a level of water loss, and they can tolerate dry conditions. There's a misnomer, or there's a confusion on the fact that the thick leaf and the waxy coat allows them to be put into full sun, and that's not always true. A good example of that is a cuba. A cuba, you can put it under a water oak and never irrigate it. If you plant it in the fall and it establishes over the winter, it can never be irrigated, and it grows great, but it needs shade. If you put it in sun, it'll scald. Alyssium, once we move into North Georgia, the floridanum does well in these environments like it's native to. So either it needs summer shade, particularly summer afternoon shade, but during the winter, it can be under deciduous trees where it's pretty much full sun during the winter, other than shade from branches. A new one that I really like, and this is something I wanted to talk about, is this concept of hybrids. So Tom Rainey at North Carolina State University is one of the best plant breeders for ornamentals in the United States, if not the world. And he's done a lot of work with creating hybrids, or interspecific hybrids of two different species. So what we're doing when we create hybrids is something called hybrid vigor. And hybrid vigor is you take two very distantly related things and you breed them together. And because they get the best traits from both of those parents, they actually are much more vigorous, or they're much more tolerant of environmental conditions. Scorpio Alyssium, and there's a couple others coming out of Tom Rainey's program, they are all going into star roses and plants, which is the ball woody line. But nonetheless, they can take full sun. And that's that idea of the hybrid vigor. So we don't really, like we would the Alyssium floridanum, have to put it into this afternoon shade. We can push it into more sun without imparting that stress. It's not true of all hybrids, okay? But a lot of these hybrid cultivars, you will find hybrid vigor that expands their usefulness in the landscape and where they can be used. So here's another one that, I like to talk about, this idea or this concept of where are plants native to. So Florida leucothwae is native to that same kind of set of circumstances that Alyssium is, but this is under deep, consistent shade. One of the things that, particularly now that the housing market has swung to mostly existing home sales, we've gotten more and more questions about what plants can we use now in those existing landscapes that have deep shade, that are existing mature landscapes. So we have to look to things that are native a lot of times, whether it's native to the US or native to Asia or Europe. What is their environment that they grow in, where they are native? In the case of Florida leucothwae, it's growing under longleaf pine in these gullies or these ditches. If anybody's been to Torrey State Park in Florida, you know the big gullies that are in that park. And Florida leucothwae grows at the bottom of those. So it gets almost no, in fact, it gets no direct sun where it's native to. So we can actually take this and we can put it in the landscape situations where it's an evergreen, it's really drought tolerant, it can grow right next to the base of longleaf pines or other evergreen trees, and we can give us that layered green evergreen look in a landscape, which a lot of people want. So the moral of this story is always look to where that plant that you're interested in using is native to. And if you can see where it's native to and what that microenvironment is, a lot of times that'll translate into our landscapes here. So again, I'll go back to the plants that have been used in landscapes for eons, okay? In this case, Thomas Jefferson actually introduced Rose of Sharon into Monticello in Virginia in late 1700, well, mid 1700s, prior to the founding of our nation, actually by about a decade. But this is another one that it roots very easily. It's grown very easily and quickly in a container for anybody who's on the nursery side. And then it transplants very easily any time of the year without a great deal of irrigation. It establishes quickly. It's got a very fine root system, so it can be used to minimize erosion. But another thing about this is a lot of these older cultivars don't suffer from a lot of insect or disease pressure. If they had, they would have been abandoned 100, 200 years ago. But a lot of the newer cultivars that are coming out and where modern plant breeding is taking over is they're eliminating some of the less desirable traits. So in the case of Rose of Sharon, one of the big issues is that it's very seedy. It seeds out and it comes up all over the place. And so if you're not using a pre-emergence herbicide, you end up doing a lot of hand weeding. Plant breeders have actually taken this a step into, for example, sugar tip is a good example of something that is not completely, but almost 100% seed sterile, but it also is variegated. So we're compounding or we're stacking these good traits on top of one another, like in the case of Rose of Sharon. So it's naturally drought tolerant, does really well in sun, establishes well, very disease tolerant from foliar diseases, very disease tolerant from the root disease perspective. But now we've stacked on top of that two traits that a lot of people were interested in, and that is sterility, as well as this variegation or foliar interest when it's not blooming. A lot of our junipers are similar. If we're looking for plants that do well in an abiotic situation, whereby they do well in really dry, really hot, exposed areas, then junipers oftentimes are what we're looking for. Junipers also, if grown in this environment, are tolerant to almost any biotic issue that we can throw at them. The only real issue with most of our junipers, in the case of our native juniper, is cedar apple rust, which I don't think is as big a problem as a lot of people make it out to be. In fact, most homeowners don't necessarily recognize it or actually think of it as an ornamental trait. And then the other is bagworm. And bagworm is fairly easy controlled with timely insecticide sprays. another native to the southeastern United States. And this is an example. Really, the only insect or the only pest issue that we have with American holly is leaf miner, holly leaf miner. Again, it's another one of those that a single timely insecticide application during emergence of the adults will pretty much eliminate the leaf miner problem on these plants. You can use a systemic insecticide or contact insecticide at that time to control the leaf miner adults that are laying eggs on the leaves. The eggs hatch and then the larvae cause the damage. So you control the adults, you eliminate the problem. It has almost no disease issues. And that's because with a lot of our native plants, they have co-evolved. So American holly is essentially co-evolved with our native Pythium and Phytophthora. And so it has some level of resistance or tolerance to that, unless it's put in just a really, really bad site. So another example of a native plant has good interest. A lot of people don't like the thorny leaves, but it's an evergreen that provides color from the berries. My favorite cultivar is Winter Sun, which has yellow berries. It was actually introduced by the USDA National Arboretum out of Beltsville, Maryland. So I'm not a big fan of red maples in the southeastern United States. One of the big reasons, and let's go again to that concept of moving from, Maine and even up into southern Canada is the northern range of red maple, all the way down into middle Georgia, down to really northern Florida, in some cases in wetter areas. We're at the far southern range of the native range for red maple, or Acer rubrum. And so when we go out into the woods and we're hiking and looking at these, in the southeast, red maple are native to boggy areas near ponds or waterways. They're usually under actually some level of other shade, whether it be pines or they're along kind of the exposure side of an opening where it gets afternoon shade and morning sun. And that tells us that they're not very heat tolerant. And yet we take these red maples and we throw them in parking lots and say, do well, and they don't. And because of the heat and the drought stress, that leads to a myriad of issues, from boring insects to leaf diseases like anthracnose and Cercospora being problems, canker issues. One of the newest canker issues is Botryopsera canker and red maple. All of these are revolved around the fact that it's not tolerant to our heat. So what do we do? Okay. In the case of red maple, I suggest we actually move to a species that's more tolerant of our heat, and that's the southern sugar maple. Some people call this Acer barbatum. Others call it Acer saccharum subspecies floridanum. But Florida sugar maple or southern sugar maple is what the industry know it as. There's a cultivar that was actually plucked out of an area and put into the trade by Bold Spring Nursery. That's Sandersville, which you see here. You don't get that really deep red color, but it's a very nice color. So you do get fall color from this. But the other thing is you can actually allow these to be grown in sunny sites, in parking lots, along subdivisions as an alley or a roadway type of a plant. So always be thinking of things. And you can ride around and look at the things that even now, early in the year, look like crap, and say, what is something that is very similar, but will survive and thrive in that environment? So when you're specking red maples, say to yourself, should I really be doing a red maple in central Georgia, or should I be doing something like the southern sugar maple that is going to perform better and have less disease and insect issues in my area because it's not under so much stress? So another one interesting, and this kind of points to the plant breeding that's going on now, is a lot of plant breeding that's occurring now on the ornamental side is for abiotic tolerance. So we're trying to increase, in many cases, there's some people that are trying to make things more pretty, there's another group of plant breeders out there that are making things tougher. And I like to use the Southgate series of rhododendron as a great example of this. So these were developed there. You can get them through the Southern Living Plants collection. But they were developed by a veterinarian who used to visit Asia quite frequently. He would collect seed off of lower elevation rhododendron where it's warmer, okay? He would bring them back to Independence, Louisiana, which is not too far up, north of Lake Pontchartrain, and he would literally throw them out into these field blocks. Whatever germinated, he would kind of transplant and line out, and then whatever survived. And after about 25 years, he developed a line of large leaf rhododendrons that do well in zone 9, okay? It's interesting, they haven't really caught on in the market. You can find them, but they never caught on because people didn't believe it. People were like, there's no way in hell this could be. You know, the large leaf rhododendron in Macon is like the Holy Grail. But we've put them at the Hort Farm in Watkinsville and at Tifton, at the Tifton Research Station in full sun, and they do great. The 3 that do the best are these 3. So because they were selected for heat tolerance in an environment that's very hot, Louisiana, because of that, they are tolerant of all of the associated stressors, such as Pythium and Phytophthora and leaf spots that would kill most things that if we took like one of the rhododendron that were native to the mountains and brought it south, we would kill that plant because the heat stress alone would just cause it to succumb to other secondary pathogens or issues, okay? These, because they tolerate the environment, they tolerate those secondary pathogens. And so always be on the lookout for these things. A lot of times it might just be you personally, before you start using them, trial them for a year or 2 in your own landscape, or have a landscape at the shop, a small area where you can trial these plants that come out that purportedly have heat tolerance or sun tolerance, especially ones that you're like, I'm a little suspicious about that, because sometimes they really do work out. So Tracheicarpus, I mentioned windmill palm from the aspect of abiotic tolerance well. And you'll see this theme. I talk a lot about abiotic tolerance because when plants aren't tolerant of the environment, they will succumb to the insects and diseases. And the insects and diseases are secondary to the plants not tolerating the environment. But windmill palm is another example. Needle palm is another. They're the 2 most cold hardy palms that we have in our arsenal currently in landscape situations. Both of them are, windmill palm is actually USDA 7B tolerant, so it'll get up into northern Georgia, even into the Chattanooga area. The needle palm is actually 6B tolerant, so it'll go throughout the state of Georgia, even into western North Carolina, like Cashiers and Highlands. And here's the needle palm. We tested this. Dr. Gary Wade, who's the predecessor of mine here, tested this in Blairsville, where it showed no damage at 5 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is over multiple seasons. So these, again, use things that you know are tolerant of the environmental conditions. In the case of palms, it's the cold tolerance, not the heat tolerance. Palms generally get cold damage, and then what happens is they get damage to the crown. That damage to the tissue in the crown, rot sets in, and it's usually a Rhizoctonia or Phytophthora-based rot, and it literally rots the crown out. So the next spring, about May, about this time of year, you can go in and you can literally lift the crown out of that palm, and it's dead as a doornail. So that's all cold damage related. I talked about a cuba. Again, I kind of go back and point to this waxy type of a leaf. Picturata is my favorite cultivar. It's pretty easy to get on the market, and I like the variegation in it. But if you look at the waxy leaf indicates 2 things in general. The first is it's more tolerant of dry conditions, not sun, but dry. The second thing is the waxy type of a coat. It's called epicuticular wax, but this waxy appearance actually helps it be tolerant of leaf diseases. So you're going to have less leaf pathogens because of this waxy coat that's exuded by the leaf. It causes water not to be retained on the leaf surface as much. It beads and runs off just like a wax would on a vehicle. Then we have things that we just have to put into our back pocket in those instances where we don't really know what's going to work. For me, if someone calls and says, I need a plant for moderate shade to full sun, clay or sand, something that I can hedge into a large hedge, I can make it into a small tree, a multi-stem tree. It doesn't really have any leaf pathogen issues. It doesn't have any root pathogen issues. You can put it in wetter sites or drier sites. We got to have these plants and a list of plants in our back pocket. It used to be we would use a lush ligustrum or Elaeagnus, both of which are invasive species, so we try not to use. But we need to have some of these, like fragrant tea olive, that we can have as go-to plants that are in really, really crappy situations, crappy environments. But there are also, and I mentioned this is at my house right here. This is the kids' climbing tree. This is a 30-foot tall, multi-stem small tree form of Osmanthus fragrans. But there are also, a lot of people don't realize there are different flower colors that you can get in a lot of these. One of the newer of these orange flowering tea olives. And that's the variety Atraanthicus. Sometimes Latin and I argue with one another. Another one I talked about, the whole concept with cold damage and freeze damage and frost damage. And I think these magnolias are a great example of this. So Magnolia John is the latest emerging large leaf or deciduous magnolia that we have in the state of Georgia. Okay, some people call these saucer magnolias, but being roughly 2 to 3 weeks later than other cultivars like Jane and Alexandria that are fairly common on the market now, 2 to 3 weeks later means that they oftentimes escape freezes. A great example is the freeze that we had, I forget when it was. It was right at Easter. At my house in Oglethorpe County, it was 26.9 and then 27.8, 2 nights in a row. John in my landscape had not emerged. Everything else, all the other magnolias, I've got butterflies, which is a yellow flowering cultivar. I've got Jane and Alexandria. They all got torched. I mean, it looked like you had taken a blowtorch to the new foliage. They had finished blooming completely and put on new foliage. Magnolia John was blooming, so the blooms got hit pretty bad, but the foliage had not emerged yet. And because the foliage had not emerged yet, it escaped damage. So the foliage came out, it looked really nice. It didn't require, as a landscape, somebody who cares about it, I would probably want to remove a lot of that damaged tissue. When you got a 25-foot tall tree, it's kind of hard to do that. So pick things in our changing environment, particularly urban environments that are more and more frequently having these late freeze or frost events. Start thinking about picking plants that break bud later if you can. Also talk about the concept of resistance. So I think all of us know about boxwood blight, okay? There's a lot of efforts by plant breeders today to breed in resistance to things that are just what, quite frankly, boxwood blight is here and it's not going anywhere, and anybody tells you different, it's a lie, they're a liar. Boxwood blight is here. What do we do about it? We do, from a plant breeder's perspective, is breed resistance. So these are 2 examples. Nugent Independence and then Freedom are both boxwoods. They're actually interspecific hybrids. So they're a hybrid between the Asian boxwood, Macrocarpa, and then our English boxwood or sempervirens. They were bred and then selected to have the English boxwood look. English boxwood is very susceptible to boxwood blight, but it's got the resistance from the Asian boxwood species. So it's got the look of one with the resistance from another. And that's where we're going in plant breeding, is trying to breed in resistance. And then we also are breeding in more of this abiotic tolerance. So flamethrower or redbud is a good example. This is a redbud that can be grown in almost, and I won't say total full sun. If you've got soil moisture, it's mulched really well, you can grow this in full sun without very much leaf scorch. If it's grown in a dry site, it will get leaf scorch, but you can grow this in full sun. It's a North Carolina state introduction. I like it because this is kind of an August picture. I mean, you can still see it's got all these different colors, foliage from chartreuse to pinks to borderline reds, and that's why they call it flamethrower. But we're working toward breeding more of this abiotic tolerance. You have to realize that, again, there are kind of two lines of thought in plant breeding today. There's a group that's breeding plants that are niche plants that might not have a lot of abiotic tolerance. But then you have plant breeders that are breeding plants for abiotic tolerances like flamethrower. Now you might ask yourself, how do I know the difference? Well, again, you can rely on resources. So you can rely on cooperative extension services, other trainings that we have that talk about things like this, publications that we're putting out that are non-biased. And then we have others. Again, anytime we're talking about this waxy colored foliage, podocarpus is a great example. Mood ring podocarpus, we're adding or we're stacking these traits of interest. So in this case, you have this new growth with this interesting coloration, in addition to the typical, I would say kind of a light red to pinkish blooms on podocarpus. But we're kind of stacking these traits. Podocarpus is one that generally, if you put it into wet sites, you get into an issue with root rot issues, particularly Phytophthora and Pythium. Mood ring being a hybrid of two different species, you can actually grow it in much wetter sites. So still likes to be in full sun, but it can take the wetter sites. So you're building in that biotic tolerance to rots. Talk about roses. Again, rose rosette is another thing that we have to deal with. There are no resistance. So if anybody comes across and says, well, I've got this rose that's resistant or tolerant to rose rosette, they're liars. Again, right now, there is no even tolerance to rose rosette, and it's an exclusion idea. But I mentioned things like Brindabella roses are some of my favorite roses on the market now because they stack or they have multiple traits of interest. So it's a new form of black spot resistance compared to knockout roses. It's a completely different genetic mechanism or genetic means of resistance. So they do not get black spot hardly at all. Okay, very slight amount in really, really humid conditions, and if you put them in too much shade. But they have that reblooming ability from knockout. What they've added is fragrance from the hybrid teas. So these are fragrant, reblooming, black spot tolerant roses. First Lady is pretty widely found on the market these days. It's great. Red Empress is gaining steam. It was introduced 2 years ago, and more growers are starting to offer it. I think next year into the following year, it'll be pretty widely available. And then we get into, again, a hybrid. In this case, it's exclamation linden plane tree. So in the Southeast, our native native sycamore is very susceptible to anthracnose, to the point that it's almost completely defoliated by mid-August, okay? So exclamation is a hybrid between European and American species. The European species impart anthracnose resistance. So this is a photograph that was taken in North Georgia in September. It's actually you hardly ever see fall foliage on it, but it's starting to get a little bit of that fall tinge to it. And this is, oh, I can't remember, Gainesville is where I took this photograph in a private landscape. Again, we have to think about this concept of plant breeding and new cultivars, but also this idea of hybrids imparting a level of vigor. The other nice thing about the exclamation is if you're looking for a deciduous tree that grows 5 feet a year, so instant gratification, this is your tree. It will literally put on 5 feet of growth in a single growing season once it is established. Talk about other things too. For example, Vitex is one that is very tolerant of dry conditions, very tolerant of full sun, okay? Don't put it into shade and don't put it in very wet sites. It's got its place in the landscape. It's sun and, you know, moderate moisture to dry, but not wet. What's nice about Vitex is, again, when you move to the coastal plain, when you're in Savannah, when you get down toward the St. Mary's River, it seeds out, okay? So flip side is one that's completely sterile. So the other thing is it is a hybrid between the Vitex Agnus castus, and we know like Shoal Creek is an example of one of the older Mike Durr introductions of Vitex, and it's a Vitex Agnus castus. It's a hybrid with Vitex rotundifolia. Rotundifolia does two things. Number one is you get this silver foliage on the bottom side, and number two, it's much less susceptible to Cercospora leaf spot, particularly late in the season. So on our Vitex, a lot of times you'll notice that it starts to defoliate late in the season, and that's the Cercospora that's causing it to defoliate. Flip side, the rotundifolia brings in the resistance. So you actually get a nice full foliage all the way until the first frost when it drops. Also, we talk about, you know, plant breeding and what we're trying to impart from an abiotic side. Wee White is another one. Oops. It is, you know, proven winners plant, Tom Rainey introduction. So we've taken Hydrangea arborescens, which is usually in the mountains, in low-lying areas, very wet soils, flops over really tall, really thin stems. And what he's done is he's compacted it down to about 18 inches tall. But also, it's been selected to grow not in wet sites. It needs decent soil moisture and a mulched area, but we can now take this and put it into landscapes. Afternoon shade, morning sun. Part of the plant breeding process too is a lot of our hydrangeas tend to be susceptible to leaf spot, particularly late season in the Cercospora and sometimes Anthracnose leaf spots. And this is not resistant, but tolerant to both of those. So you get better foliage later into the season, reblooming and shorter size. So we're checking a lot of boxes. Some of those being biotic tolerances, some of them being abiotic tolerances. And then we're doing a lot of work now with, and I love this cultivar name, Chastity. So we're taking things that we know, again, like I mentioned, Forsythia, the first slide, we're taking things that have been out there for a long time. Ornamental pears will grow pretty much in anything but solid concrete. And I've even seen some growing in the cracks of concrete. But the problem is they seed everywhere. So plant breeders have come through and taken a species that is tolerant of a lot of leaf spots. It does get some Cercospora late in the season and some Anthracnose and a few others of the leaf spots late season. But it's taken this really tough plant and it's done one thing to it to appease the invasive species, folks. It's now 97125% sterile. So it's virtually sterile. And because of that, we can start using this again in these urban, really poor soil sites. And for time, I'm going to kind of move on a second. I've got a couple more. I wanted to mention on the perennial side, this Sombrero series. These are proven winners plants. This was the Best at the Ball open house in 2019 that I visited. So another thing that we're doing is we're taking a lot of natives and we're creating these native Rs. Why are native Rs gaining in popularity? They are because, again, I'm going to go back to that theory, they have co-evolved with a lot of our pathogens. So in the case of Echinacea, they had identified populations of Echinacea that were tolerant or resistant to powdery mildew and, in some cases, downy mildew. So they used that for breeding. 15 years ago, Echinacea were popular, but they would get powdery mildew at the wazoo once we hit August. So at that point, we would just, as plant breeders, breed in from native populations powdery mildew resistance. And now we have a garden plant that is very, very good late into the season and blooms heavily in the spring, takes a break when it's hot, and blooms fairly heavily again in the fall. Again, I'll talk about something that's invasive. So this lantana, one thing that we're doing as plant breeders is we're taking these invasive species that is got a bad name in coastal plain areas like Florida in particular, where it's got all the environmental and biotic or pest tolerance you could ever want, except for lantana lacebug, which is pretty easy to control with a contact insecticide. But other than that, it's tolerant of so much, but it's gotten a bad name because it's invasive. So plant breeders are breeding in sterility. This is Bloomify Rose. This was introduced by the University of Florida. I can't remember who picked it up, branding company-wise, but it's completely sterile. And so now we can start using these plants that once we're deemed kind of bad actors or invasive species, we're bringing them back into the trade. Again, this is one of those other native Rs. I've talked about those because I'm going to kind of move on. Fatsia is another one. We talk about plants with that waxy foliage color or waxy foliage, epicuticular leaf wax, very tolerant of foliar diseases because that protection that's offered by that waxy cuticle on the leaves. And then I kind of end with this. These are three that I've actually introduced in my plant breeding program. And this is where we're going as plant breeding. So these are three different gardenias. They're trialed for two things. So root rot tolerance to Pythium and Phytophthora in wetter sites, and cold tolerance. So these were trialed in zone 6B. So they are cold tolerant across the state of Georgia and actually into North Carolina, Tennessee, and a few places north of that. But they're also, we inoculated all of these. So we purposefully infected them with Phytophthora and Pythium to see if they would die. And so the three cultivars here, from a plant breeding perspective, we have selected. So we obviously threw out all the ones that got damaged and certainly the ones that died. The ones that were tolerant of that infection, that we actually infected them on purpose, the ones that were left standing, we actually introduced. So this is where plant breeding is going to be more and more important, is breeding in these tolerances to pest diseases and then also the abiotic side. And again, I'll kind of wrap up. You can kind of see this Swan Princess is a small one. Swan Maiden is a medium-sized gardenia, and Swan Queen is a larger-sized gardenia. But I'll go back to where I kind of started this with, and that is if you pick plants that will tolerate the environment that you put them in, okay? And in the case of really poor environments, look back to antebellum plants that were introduced in the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s. Use those because we know that they're tough. They have a proven track record. And then start trialing these newer cultivars that purport or they're supposedly have these environmental tolerances or pest tolerances, and you can slowly add to your plant palette or the number of plants that you're growing or installing with these newer cultivars. But always trial them is one thing I say. Always trial things before you start using them extensively. And that's what I had today. Anybody who has any questions, you're welcome to call me or email me. You can look me up. Just Google search for my name and UGA, and you'll see my ugly mug. It's usually the first link that pops up. So feel free to give me a call if you have questions, and that includes the folks that are listening to this later on.
Right. Well, thank you, Matthew. Great program and tremendous information. We will be back next week. We have the pruning guru. So all the stuff that Matthew's been talking about that's been growing well, you got to figure out how to cut that stuff back and do it the right way. And so Rick Smith will be with us, and many of y'all have known Rick for years. He does a great job. So come back next week, catch that. If you have any questions, of course, you can always email Mary Kay or send an email to the office at georgiauac.com address. And y'all go to the UAC website. There is so much information. Mary Kay and Kathy are always updating upcoming webinars, upcoming events. I know we have a live event in Tucker coming up in June, so we can do the mask-free thing, Lord willing, get out of this COVID stuff we've been doing and get back to a little bit of normal. So we look forward to that. I hope that you'll make plans for it. Matthew, thank you again, and thanks everyone that has been a member of the Urban Ag Council. And those that aren't, jump on. Come on, we'd love to have you. We appreciate y'all. Have a great day, a great week, and we'll look for you on Wednesday of next week. Thanks, guys and gals. Y'all have a great day.
Okay, everybody. Bye-bye.